previously, for a long time, I was quite driven by my head, and my journey in the last, well, something like 30 years has been to get into better balance with the heart. But of course, both are useful, and it is that question of finding a balance that I think is so important. When I began to change my life some 30 years back, realizing that I was too head-based and therefore kind of not connecting to that deeper realm that you've heard mentioned in the meditations. When that happened, I didn't really have the equipment in my head to match that with what was happening in my heart. I met people who were good at generating a very beautiful vibration of peace and truth and love, and I drank at that well, but I couldn't really generate it that well myself because my head didn't say, yes, this is true. My head said, well, this feels lovely and it feels true, but what is all this talk about soul and God and, you know, a deeper reality? It didn't have any place in my cognition, in the structure of ideas that were in my head. And so for many years, really, I struggled with this. It meant that I moved along rather slowly in my spiritual journey. It's okay, because everything is fine. You know, you learn this when you go deeper into the way this whole play of life that we're in works. But so everything's okay, but I was a slow learner. And a few years back, I had an opportunity to connect with some of the frontier science that is emerging now, which is much more directly associated with, supportive of the spiritual dimension, the spiritual perspective. And it's really from that side that I want to concentrate tonight. You've received some beautiful wisdom in those quotes, in the lovely atmosphere, and I'm going to ask you, for better or for worse, some of you may feel that my cognitive approach is not what you were looking for, but maybe with a title like tonight, you are here knowing that perhaps this would be something that would tackle things at that level of understanding, not just experience. Experience can lead to understanding, certainly, but when I had those experiences in the early days, I used to say that I'd undergone an intellect bypass operation in order to allow my heart to feel free. In other words, I dropped the ideas, the materialistic ideas that my head was filled with, in order to allow that lovely experience of peace that you've been hearing about tonight. But now, I feel as if the two sides are coming together, because there is this new paradigm in science. It is actually as old as the hills in a way, and it certainly goes back 80 years to the foundations of quantum mechanics, a branch of physics that is fully accepted as being more deep and more real than conventional classical physics, Newtonian action and reaction physics. Quantum mechanics describes the way the universe works at a very, very fundamental level. It arose from the discoveries when scientists were looking at how molecules, atoms, the subatomic world worked. They found that it didn't follow the traditional physical laws. There were strange connections between particles. You could separate them, and if once they'd been associated, you could put them on the other side of the universe, and they would talk to each other instantaneously. Strange phenomena like this, which have been proven and which work out mathematically and experimentally. And they also found, much to their astonishment, because these scientists were steeped in the materialism that was so dominant for a couple of hundred years in Europe, they found that consciousness and matter seemed to, at the very least, to be interdependent. You didn't get particles until you had a conscious observer to actually collapse what they call the wave function, which in quantum mechanics it's a mathematical term that describes a huge range of possibilities of where a particle could be if a conscious observer goes in to look for it. But until that observer observes it, clicks it into being, so to speak, it remains non-material in a sense. It remains a mathematical entity of all these different places where it might be. But it isn't in any of them, and it isn't in all of them. It's just a range of possibilities. So this was very mysterious to the world of science, and it remains mysterious to many within science, because they decided that they'd take the discoveries of quantum mechanics and use them, and they lie behind many modern inventions, including microprocessors. Without the understanding of quantum mechanics, we wouldn't have had the IT revolution. But they put on one side these mysterious aspects. Now this new paradigm, which a paradigm, by the way, means like a mental map that you have in your head, and you compare reality with that map, and if it fits, you accept it. If it doesn't, then you tend to put it on one side as some oddity. And in the past, because of our materialistic paradigm, oddities like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, telekinesis, many different phenomena that didn't fit the idea that matter is the basic reality, they've just been put on one side, and yet many people will have experienced them. Yeah, I've got some slides that I wanted to show you, and maybe we could put up the first one. We are conscious agents in the traditional language of the great faith traditions. We're souls with minds that shape reality, including the brain. This is a central shift in the new paradigm, away from materialism, which says matter is the primary reality, that we got here through a big bang that somehow put out of the singularity, the point of nothingness, emerged this massive universe. It evolved over 13.7 billion years into galaxies and stars and planets and planetary systems, solar systems, life emerging, becoming more complex, and over millions of years you get a brain and you end up with Neville, with a mind, and all of us. This is the conventional view, and yet, you know, so many have also held on to the idea that there is a spirit, there is that other side. But even people who have that faith and that experience of another dimension of reality that is nourishing and true, and yet there is this mismatch, which means sometimes that there isn't real power in our lives to behave in accordance with the dictates of spirit. Instead, we get swept along by materialism, as we all know. So the new paradigm, which they call the consciousness-based paradigm, says consciousness is primary. Consciousness is like the ground of being, and consciousness actually is the creator of this material world. Now, how can that be? Because surely consciousness means that I'm here conscious in front of you, but hit me on the head with a hammer and I might become unconscious. But some of the data I'll be showing you indicates that even when I'm unconscious in a conventional sense, that I'm not standing, say I fall over, I've lost my consciousness in the sense of the narrow ability to cope with this scene that is in front of me, a conscious awareness of the present moment. But my consciousness may, even when I'm unconscious in that conventional sense, my consciousness may continue. And there's quite a bit of data supporting that idea. Nevertheless, next slide please, most neuroscientists will hold to the idea that we are our brains. This is despite some of the evidence that I'll be showing you. This is a quote from Deepak Chopra and Rudolf Tanzi, a professor of neurology at Harvard. Deepak Chopra, of course, well known for his many books about the mind-body connections, and he really tries to tell us that our minds are much more powerful than we realize. And the new paradigm is very supportive of that kind of perspective. Another term for it, by the way, is post-materialist science. Very kind of, I like that term. It makes it sound kind of very trendy and, you know, as if it's kind of very respectable, not too fringy. Post-materialist science. And Deepak Chopra and Tanzi, this was from an article in the Huffington Post, appeared about 3 years back, called "Good News, You Are Not Your Brain." And they were citing some recent papers supportive of that position. Next slide, please. In the article, they pointed out that it's been impossible, despite an explosion of research into the brain and in consciousness studies, it's been impossible to show how molecules, the brain, acquire the qualities of the mind. And brain activity just isn't the same as thinking, feeling, seeing, colors, the beauty of the world, of faces. We can point to mechanisms that correlate our experience with what's happening in the brain, and modern techniques for looking at inside the brain as we function are very advanced. The correlations are there most of the time, but not always. So it's impossible to construct a theory of the mind based on material objects, like molecules, that somehow became conscious. This is the assertion from these guys, and I think they're right. And actually, most neuroscientists, even though they still hold on to the belief that we are our brains, they admit that as far as the research has gone so far, it's been impossible to construct a theory of how the mind, with all its intricacies of perception, emerges from the brain, how consciousness emerges from the brain. Okay, next slide, please. One of the things that challenges the traditional way of thinking is this phenomenon of neuroplasticity. It means, a bit like it sounds, that the brain is plastic. It used to be thought, up to about 20, 30 years back, that our brains really became pretty well fixed by the time we were in our late teens. And then you'd add information, but basically your personality, everything was fixed. And it was just in old age that you might suffer a decline, and that would be that. Now they know that the brain changes with every thought and feeling. And when you have certain persistent types of thought and feeling, your brain reflects that and predisposes you to have the same kind of thought and feeling. It's like a muscle. You know, rather puny muscles here, they're not being used all that enough. But if I used it much more, I would get a nice big bicep there. And the brain is similar. If you're using it in particular ways, and they're quite detailed, the brain mapping that has been possible with current techniques, showing that different parts of the brain build up according to how you're using them. Or if you're not using that faculty, that it may fade. The use it or lose it principle operates. Next slide, please. Yes, there is a slot there that I don't understand why it's doing that. It's the flowers. It's their fragrance. This book, The Brain That Changes Itself, is a magnificent review of this neuroplasticity phenomenon. As the New York Times said, the power of positive thinking finally gains scientific credibility. If you choose on a regular basis to have a particular type of thought and feeling, your brain will change to help you have more of that. This is, really very, very well demonstrated now. But I think it's a misnomer. Next slide, please. As Norman Doidge, the psychiatrist who wrote this wonderful book, says, we've yet to understand how thoughts change brain structure, but although it's clear that they do. And if you think that you are the brain, as 99% of materialistic science would say that we are, then it's a big puzzle. How can the brain change itself? Where do those thoughts come from that can change itself? But if you understand that we might be, or you might even develop the confidence that we are something other than the brain, a soul or a conscious agent, as in this new paradigm, then it becomes much more easy to recognize that you, if you take the reins of the mind, can make the choices that will change the brain. But you can do that because you're not the brain. This is the kind of thinking that may be familiar to some of you, but for many of us is really quite new. Next slide, please. One field of evidence for this is the near-death experience, which scientists who've studied it say really it should be called the death experience, because there's so much evidence now that it's not a phenomenon produced by the dying brain, some hallucination. It really is a consistent experience. There are thousands of cases reported from across the world where thanks to the advances in resuscitation techniques, people do die clinically. Their heart stops beating, there's no breathing, there's no blood circulating, there's no electrical activity in the brain, and then they're brought back, and quite commonly, not always, but quite commonly, they have a description of their consciousness having continued beyond when they were dead. And it's a very consistent kind of story. It includes things like, to begin with, they're still semi-connected to the body, and it's as if they're hovering in the operating theatre, watching the surgeons rush around trying to revive them. Then they may go further. They sometimes have a life review where they get some realization of how they might have hurt someone years ago, and it just comes in front of them to settle. And then they very commonly speak of going through this tunnel of light into a realm of warmth and love and peace, where they feel very interconnected. Next slide, please. This is a summary by Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, who did a major study of the near-death experience in Holland. 5 hospitals were involved. It lasted several years. And he found that he's written it up in a paper that was published in The Lancet, and in this very fine book, Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience. Enveloped by light, people experience total acceptance and unconditional love and have access to a deep knowledge and wisdom with indescribable clarity and insight. It really is hard for them to find the words to describe it when they come back into the body, because it's as if our brains, brilliant though they are, it's as if they enable us to play very specific parts. They're like a filter that gives you the consciousness, the awareness that you need to handle your everyday life. But when you're released from the brain, it's as if you go into the sort of script of the play that we're in, or like sometimes some of the scientists compare it to being like the DVD in the projection room in a cinema, where you sense that you're connected to the whole story, not just to the unfolding scene that's in front of you.